This is Gecko Moria. This elephantine long-necked gothic Batman is the primary antagonist of Thriller Bark, whose genuinely fascinating and well-implemented ideas are masked by controversial aesthetics and an impression of general failure. Even I, man on the internet, am not immune to this, and I often construct humorous statements at Moria's expense. But today I am going to give you the fairest Gecko Moria video on the internet, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the tragic, the lazy, and the criminally misunderstood Gecko Moria. I'm not going to waste any time with this one. Gecko Moria is weird, and Oda did his absolute best to ease you into that weirdness. Going through Thriller Bark is a bit like going through a haunted house at a carnival. It has that blend of scary yet wacky, because the goal of a haunted house is to use fear in a fun way, which is why Oda chooses Nami, Usopp, and Chopper to be the characters to initially step through Thriller Bark, the most comically over-the-top, easy-to-scare crew members, reacting to all of these absurd dancing, zombies, ghosts, and trees. Honestly, I think this arc is Oda at his most creative, because every new page you turn results in something crazy happening, like a person coming out of a painting, a living bear rug, or ghosts that just make you feel like really bad about your current life circumstances, you know? This is a marked step up of wacky in One Piece, and all of it is because Oda is preparing you for something even more crazy. This is not going to be your standard cool, powerful villain guy, and it's not going to be your standard motivation for a villain either. No, Oda's priming you for something more of an acquired taste, because when the story waiter comes to your table, he takes off the cloche and reveals Gecko Moria, you're gonna need to have a pretty open mind about trying it. And I really love Moria's teaser introduction where we see this colossal figure lying in darkness. All we see of his face are eyes and teeth, which is very similar to Big Mom's introduction. And I think that both of them are equally as effective in giving us a sense of overwhelming power, like this nightmare lurking in the shadows that we need to be afraid of. However, I can't quite say the same for Moria's official introduction, which is pretty plain for a One Piece villain. He's just sitting there and all of that fear and mystery that was so carefully crafted in the teaser immediately dissipates for me personally. Now, I should say there is a good reason for this underwhelming introduction, which has to do with Moria's core themes, which we'll get into in a bit. However, a big part of why Moria's introduction doesn't hit me quite as hard as many others is because of his design. It's quite immersion breaking because I find myself wondering less who is this guy, and more why did the author choose to draw someone who looks like this guy? Initially, it takes me out of the experience. Although that's very subjective, I do not expect everyone to feel the same way. But what is consistent is that Gecko Moria's character design is out there even by One Piece standards. Gecko Moria seems like an idea that Oda was never quite sold on, and we went through some pretty drastic redesigns during his conceptualization. So what you're looking at now right here is the original Gecko Moria. He was supposed to be a pastor with a split personality. Ooh, interesting, but he looks a bit too plain. So then Oda gave Moria a much more elaborate and mysterious design by turning him into this terrifying man in a mask before going F it and creating this misshapen monster who is implied to be cobbled together out of other body parts due to all of the stitches and stuff. And that eventually got turned into the Moria we know today. Ichiro Oda's vision for Gecko Moria was very inconsistent and arguably not really existent, especially when you compare it to the original Doflamingo and Mihawk designs that are featured alongside Moria. And I'm not convinced that Oda ever had a strong idea for him. Of all of the warlords, Moria feels like, oh mate, I need a seventh one of those dudes. Why did I choose 7? Should have been the 6 warlords. And then what Oda does is he picks up all of the scraps he's left on the floor and like smushes them together in a bowl to create Gecko Moria. However, I think that Oda does a pretty good job at turning Moria into something very interesting. Rather unusually, Gecko Moria is also introduced with his own personal motto, which I'm not sure if that's ever happened before or since Moria, but it's very important that we know this from the Gecko. Gecko Moria's philosophy is, you do it, although he sums it up much more eloquently later in the arc. In the past, I was too full of ambition and overconfident in my own abilities, but then I realized how important it was to have superior underlings. I will never do anything on my own again. I'll become the Pirate King simply by using the help of others. So Gecko Moria is the kind of person who believes that he can change the world by tweeting about something that he doesn't like, and then hoping it'll pick up enough traction for someone to actually go and do something about it. And really, Gecko Moria doesn't actually do much of anything during Thriller Bark, with the exception of piloting oars in the very final and very short fight. He does almost literally nothing, and that is by design. Design or not, I actually found it quite difficult to write this video, because generally I speak about how actions enforce these villains, and in this case, case, Moria's tale is one of inaction. For example, when the Straw Hats invade Thriller Bark, Moria somehow finds a way to do even less than he was already doing, which was nothing, and he finds an even more prone position to be in. And then when finally pushed into doing a thing, his main method of combat is to put on his hidden leaf forehead protector, then scream Kagebunshi no Jutsu, and create literal shadow clones to fight on his behalf. But there is a very sound reason for this lazy philosophy, which is that in the past, being super active and overly ambitious cost Gecko Moria everything. Also, this video is sponsored by BetterHelp, a platform designed to connect you with a licensed therapist, trained to listen and provide you with helpful, unbiased advice. There is no way around it. Starting therapy, it is difficult, and it often involves far more steps than you think. You got to find the right therapist in the right area at the right time. You've got to do so much right that there's not a lot left of energy and caring and everything. I'm like, it's exhausting. But BetterHelp can match you to one of over 30,000 therapists in their network, with sessions available as phone calls, live chats, messaging, whatever works for you, whenever it works for you. Very handy for people like me who aren't the biggest fans of face-to-face interaction, and also handy for the 4 million plus people who have already used BetterHelp to start healthy, happier lives. And you can do the same through my link in the description. To get started, you just need to fill out a questionnaire describing your specific needs, and in most cases, you'll be matched with your therapist within 48 hours. And if the therapist you're matched with isn't quite the right fit, then no worries, that's very common when starting therapy. And in that case, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no extra cost. And also no stressing about all of the stuff like the insurances and the networks and da. So if you think that you might benefit from therapy, then consider BetterHelp. And if you visit through my link in the description, then you'll get 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. So give BetterHelp a go and see if it's the right fit for you. But for now, it's back to you, me. Moria was present at Roger's execution, and he was one of the original captains to set sail in the great age of piracy. At one point, believe it or not, Gecko Moria was a front runner to find the One Piece and become the next pirate king. However, his dreams were unceremoniously crushed in the New World when the Gecko pirates fought Kaido and the Beast pirates on Wano. I mean, just think about that for a second. Gecko Moria made it all the way to Wano. That is pretty damn far in the New World, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. But Kaido and the Beast pirates massacred Moria's entire crew, leaving only Moria himself alive, and the mental devastation of that event caused Moria's fixation on creating zombies, because he simply could not bring himself to lose more friends. So instead, he turned to disposable crew members with no emotional attachment. But losing to Kaido was a huge shock to Moria himself, who clubbed him in the face with the reality of his own weakness, making him unwilling to personally participate in combat in the future. That's because deep down, Gecko Moria knows that he will never be strong enough to become the Pirate King. So the logic there is, if I can't ever do it, then why do anything at all? Instead, why not acquire the shadows of some people much more stronger than I to fight for me? So while it is tempting to write Gecko Moria off as being lazy, that's really not the case. From his point of view, he has no other option, and what he's doing is actually working smarter, not harder, which is a cool idea, definitely unique for One Piece, but I don't think it really takes shape during Thriller Bark itself, which is where it really needed to. One big issue is that Moria's story is directly tied to Kaido, a character who at that stage we knew nothing about except for his name and a terribly drawn silhouette. So the Moria appreciation tends to come a lot later in the story, which is not amazing. I mean, I think it's great to continue to get more depth about characters after they've served their main roles. For example, Whitebeard. I was thrilled to find out more about him in the Oden flashback, but I was also 100% satisfied by his role during the Marineford arc, where he was fully fleshed out, and then everything else down the line was a bonus. Moria is kind of the opposite. His flesh comes much later down the line, and Thriller Bark shows us the bonus remains of what was once a very ambitious man-thing. Most villains in One Piece are designed to provide a direct contrast to Luffy in their own unique areas, like how Don Krieg is willpower versus firepower, Buggy challenges Luffy's philosophy on treasure, and Tomorrow Black is the complete antithesis to everything that is Luffy. In Moria's case, that contrast is active ambition versus passive ambition, because to his credit, Gecko Moria has not given up on his dream. He's decided to pursue it just through a different path. It's creative, I like it. He's doing a passive run of One Piece in parallel to Luffy's run, and the perfect page to show the difference between them is when Luffy comes across Moria for the first time. Luffy's there, he's ready, he's active, he is going to beat up this Moria man with his own hands to take all of the shadows back and go on to achieve his dreams, hurrah! And then there's Gecko Moria right next to him, bigger in every way bar ambition, and he actively refuses to lift even a single finger in his effort to become the Pirate King. In this moment, Gecko Moria is a glorified Snorlax lying in the way of our game progress, and Luffy does not appreciate it. This panel right here is the unstoppable force versus the immovable rock. Whose ideology is going to prevail? Luffy's, obviously, because he's the main character, but there's also some great commentary on what it takes to have the quality qualities of a captain and the idea of obedience in general. When Moria first inserts Luffy's shadow into Oars, the first thing Moria tells him is that he is now his underling, and Oars with Luffy's shadow replies, "Underling? No way! I have a dream. This place is stuffy and boring. I'm gonna go outside. I'll set sail around the world." And Moria insists that the shadow will eventually lose the tendencies of its original owner, and it will become completely obedient to him. I would say that the battle on Thriller Bark takes place more within and against Oars than it does against Moria, which is both metaphorically and literally true. We spend so much time fighting Oars, much more than Moria. But it's a question of willpower. Will Luffy's shadow submit to Gecko Moria and effectively make Luffy give up on his dream, or will Luffy's ambition endure its greatest test to date? The answer is no, the ambition would not endure, apparently, and Luffy was forced to give up on his dream, at least Shadow Luffy was, because Oars does eventually succumb and accept Moria as his master, which leads to this fascinating conversation between Luffy and Oars, which is essentially a conversation between Luffy and himself. Luffy can't believe what Oars is saying, and he now has to physically fight a representation of himself to prove his ambition, or else, just like his shadow, it's going to be stolen from him by Gecko Moria, who will submit the Straw Hats to the same pain, loss, and destruction of dreams as he was subject to. To a lesser extent, Gecko Moria is also designed to contrast Brook, because this is his Straw Hat character arc. Both Moria and Brook are characters who represent the idea of stagnation. Both are former pirate captains who lost their entire crew in very tragic ways, and have ended up occupying this space in the Florian Triangle together, unable to move on, with the sole difference between them being willpower. Because one, Moria, is stagnant by choice, and the other, Brook, is stagnant by circumstance. He wants to go, but he can't get free. Whereas Gecko Moria, he can go free, but he doesn't want to go. And it's quite depressing because Brook describes his life as follows. 50 years in these dark waters. It was so long, and it was all for nothing. So desolate, my life was so dreary. But despite that, Brook had the will to endure. His loss made him stronger, but Moria's loss made him weaker. It scarred him from participating in conflict, and it led him to retreating to the darkest corner of the world, where no scary Kaidos could ever come to hurt him again. So here Oda presents us with two very different ways of dealing with tragedy, and also a very stern warning for events to come. I wouldn't say this is a favorable comparison, but I also consider Moria to be the Don Krieg of the Grand Line, because ultimately his character serves as a warning for the new world. Someone with ambition who set out to a higher level of sea was utterly decimated and forced to retreat. In East Blue, Krieg is a warning and a skill test for Luffy's readiness to enter the Grand Line, and in the Grand Line, Moria is a warning and a skill test for Luffy's readiness to enter the new world. And even though Luffy does eventually beat Moria, Moria judges that he has failed. With your strength, you'll just die anyway if you continue your voyage. You're not fit for the new world. It seems that you have a couple of good underlings, but you'll lose all of them. And in the very next arc, exactly that happens. Luffy loses his entire crew. So Luffy really should have taken these words a bit more seriously, but Luffy does not take Gecko Moria seriously at all, such as when he stated, "So anyway, I'm gonna go beat up Moria." That is the glorious call to battle our captain uses walking into the climax of Thriller Bark. And I think that's how we as readers, or at least how I felt as well, because Moria, he's a warlord of the sea. Oh, big deal. We've already beaten one of those dudes ages ago. Also, his bounty is only 320 million berries, which was barely above Luffy's then current 300 million. Although in Moria's defense as a warlord, his bounty was frozen, so that doesn't necessarily reflect his current threat level. But also, it kind of does, because you're not supposed to think about that. You're meant to see the big number and go, wow, big number. And when he's outside of Oars, a lot of Moria's fight is also turned into a joke, with Luffy kicking him up the butt, and there's one point where Moria runs away from Luffy instead of fighting with anything, even his doppelman. And it's like, what other warlord would do this? He's running away like a Scooby-Doo villain. Moria's not even taken seriously in-world, because the world government sent fellow warlord of the sea Bartholomew Kuma to be his babysitter on Thriller Bark, out of concern that Moria can't hold his own. And look, they were right to do so, because Gecko Moria is a literal one and done. After getting out of Oars, Moria powers up, then he starts and ends his 1v1 against Luffy in a single chapter, which is 482. So in terms of fight duration, he's about on par with Bellamy. But let's look at some positives here. Something I do really love about Moria is his devil fruit. I don't feel like we ever really got to see how amazing these powers could be, but there's a lot of conceptually strong ideas, such as Moria's revelation that the body and the shadow must always move as one. So if he manipulates the shadow, then the body has to contort to follow. I would have loved to have seen more of that, like maybe Moria manipulating the Straw Hat shadows and turning them into these crazy wacky shapes. But then again, he's a bit too passive to put himself in that kind of direct combat situation. However, Shadow's Asgard Moria has to be one of the coolest activation panels in One Piece, Piece, with Moria's red demonic eyes piercing the darkness of the Florian Triangle in order to claim all of those delicious shadows. This is the kind of Moria I wish we saw more of. There are glimpses of how amazing he can be here and there, and Shadow's Asgard arguably makes him one of the most powerful beings ever formed in One Piece. In that form, Moria was ripping through islands like biscuits before dinner, and something I definitely don't think that Moria gets enough credit for is that he's one of the only villains who has ever taken on all of the Straw Hats at once. Granted, he did it through Oars, but if not for Nightmare Luffy, he probably would have beaten the entire crew. He's a lot more of a threat than he gets credit for. But the reason why he doesn't get any of that credit is because these threats are undermined and hidden at every turn. To go back to Kuma, I definitely don't think it helps that a second warlord appears who actually does manage to defeat the entire crew, making Moria seem a little bit lame by comparison. Imagine if during Alabasta, Doflamingo appeared to have a bit of a chit chat with Crocodile, then Crocodile was beaten, and Doflamingo soloed the entire crew. That would take a lot away from Crocodile. And this doesn't get any better in retrospect either, because after finding out Kuma's backstory, that character becomes so much more compelling and commands even more attention than he originally did. However, I will say that Kuma plays very nicely into Gecko Moria's theme of obedience. Moria even calls Kuma the most obedient warlord, and Kuma is a direct counter to Moria's powers. Because as a cyborg, sure, I guess you can try and steal his shadow, but he will never be obedient to Moria. That's just not his programming. So Kuma's even beating Gecko Moria at his own idea. But also, Moria only really starts to take an active role by piloting his meat mech Oars after Kuma arrives. So Kuma gets to the island, he delivers the message from the world government, and then Moria instantly becomes obedient, as if he's been caught wanking at work by his boss, showing us once and for all that Moria is not the company owner he claims to be, but an employee, and one who is extremely obedient whenever his big bosses are mentioned. He's also a very unfortunate sandwich victim. In the grand scheme of arc antagonists, Gecko Moria slots right between Rob Lucci and Kizaru, which is not a great place to be. And in general, I think the impression of Thriller Bark suffers a lot from its direct juxtaposition with Water 7 and Sabati. But we do have some more good news because Gecko Moria does have a post-villain arc. Gecko Moria goes on to appear during Marineford, but there's really not a whole lot more to say about him here. This event really was more of a full stop on everything we knew about him, which is that he's just not good enough to compete on this level. He was a big shadowy fish in a small and polluted pond that no one ever goes near because it smells weird. And Doflamingo even states that Moria isn't strong enough to be a warlord anymore, and the world government tries to assassinate Moria for the crime of being weak. This is his lowest point. At this stage, Moria has lost everything. His crew, his warlord title, the respect from both the readers and the in-world characters, and he takes a long time to reflect on this, choosing not to reappear until over 300 chapters and 8 years later when he's invading Hachinosu and gets caught by Blackbeard. It's then assumed that he escaped off-screen during Garp's invasion of Hachinosu, where Garp also got captured. So there you go, look, Moria did exactly what Garp did, just less cool. But Gecko Moria's future is now a giant question mark. For most of the last decade, this character has been in limbo, which, to be fair, is exactly what he was doing when he was relevant as well. He was stagnating on Thriller Bark, and now he's still doing that, just in a more mobile way. I have no idea where Gecko Moria is going to land in the grand scheme of the story. I'm actually a bit surprised that he didn't join Blackbeard when it was offered. However, that does tell us one important thing about Gecko Moria, which is that he has reignited at least part of his ambition. Previously, he was willing to sell himself to the world government to be in a position of comfort, but now, potentially with his life on the line, he refuses to submit to another higher power. Whatever Gecko Moria is doing, it's now on his own terms. And while it's not the greatest and most fleshed out post-villain character arc in One Piece, it is something, and it holds a sliver of promise for the future. When all is said and done, Moria is a monument to Eiichiro Oda willing to take risks with the highest selling and what is quite possibly the most scrutinized manga of all time. He could have done something easy and generic and crowd-pleasing, but he didn't. And that's commendable, even if it didn't quite pay off as much as he may have hoped. There's a lot of great ideas going on with Gecko Moria, but to me, they don't hit as hard as what most other arc antagonists have to offer. But Gecko Moria, he put in a decent job, so we'll give him a decent C tier. And you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next.